This video lecture should come right after your Slinky lab. What we're going to be talking about in this video lecture are waves, specifically transverse waves and a little bit on longitudinal waves. This is really an informational lecture, and notes should be taken with the adjoining note sheet. Okay, so here we go. When we talk about waves, really we're talking about something very specific. Okay? If for some reason you decide that you want to move energy from one place to another, you can transfer energy by transferring it through a medium or through a chunk of matter. And if you transfer energy without also transferring the matter, then that is done by using a wave. If I transfer energy and also transfer the matter, then that is done with some force or by throwing something. But just the transfer of energy without the transfer of matter is known as a wave. There are different types of waves. One of the types of waves that we have is a transverse wave. On a transverse wave, the pulse or the wave or the energy travels in one direction. In this case, it's traveling to the right, while my medium, or what my wave moves through, is moving at right angles to that direction. So in transverse waves, my wave moves perpendicular to the direction that my medium moves. So this is like, which way is my pulse traveling, which way is my tape traveling, kind of thing. That's a transverse wave. The other type of wave that we have is a longitudinal wave. In a longitudinal wave, my energy travels in one direction. In this case, it's moving to the right, and my medium vibrates in the same direction as the energy moves, but it vibrates back and forth. Okay, so this is like the pushing of the Slinky, and my tape moves back and forth. There are different parts that we have on waves, and generally we're going to be talking about transverse waves because they're the easiest to look at, but we will talk a little bit about longitudinal waves because longitudinal waves are very important. The nice thing about longitudinal waves is we can convert them and look at them as transverse waves, and they behave similarly. Okay. One of the parts of a wave is the amplitude, and the amplitude is really just the distance from the rest position of my medium to the highest point, or to the lowest point. It's the maximum distance from that rest position. Notice here that my symbol for amplitude is capital A, and my units of amplitude are meters. It is a distance measurement. Wavelength. Wavelength is the distance between any point and the next same point on the wave. So notice here when I labeled it, I labeled the top and the top. So I'm looking at the top of the hill to the top of the hill. That's one wavelength. I could also go the bottom of the valley to the bottom of the valley. That would be one wavelength, and those two distances would be the same. Here I'm also doing from where it's going up to where it's going up, and that is one wavelength. Notice here that my symbol for wavelength is, I'm going to butcher this and everybody's going to make fun of me, lambda, and my units again are meters because it is a length, and length is in meters. Okay? There are different points on the wave that I will talk about. One of those points is known as the crest, and the crest is the topmost point of the wave, and the other is the trough, and the trough is the lowest point. So I kind of think about this as the mountain crest and the peak trough. Okay? That's for transverse waves. Now when we move on to longitudinal waves, we really only care about two parts of a longitudinal wave. One of those parts is this big spread out region, which is known as a rarefaction. And one of these parts is where they are closer together, and that's known as a compression. Okay? A compression is a point on a medium that the longitudinal wave is moving through where it has a maximum density. So it's where my medium is very close together. The particles of my medium are very close together. When I was using the Slinky, it would be where the Slinky is pushed together as the energy moves through it. Okay? And the rarefaction is just the opposite. It's where it has the minimum density. So when I'm looking here, it would be like where my Slinky was spread apart as it was moving through. Okay? Here's just a few other wave vocabulary terms. Frequency. When we're talking about frequency, we're talking about how frequently a wave passes a point per second. Oftentimes we think of it as waves per second, pulses per second, beats per second, something per second when we're talking about how frequently something is happening. Our symbol for frequency is lowercase f, and our units for frequency are hertz, and our hertz is really 1 over seconds. So when we're talking about hertz, we're talking about 1 over seconds. Because notice here that waves does not have a unit and pulses does not have a unit. So it just gets a 1, and second has a seconds unit. Okay. Period. Our symbol for period is capital T. Our units for period are seconds. It's the time it takes for one full wavelength to pass a point. Okay? Frequency was how many wavelengths pass a point per second. Period is how many seconds it takes for one full wavelength. Frequency and period are opposites of one another. Okay? So if I know the frequency, I know that the period is the inverse of the frequency. And if I know the period, I know that my frequency is the inverse of that. Okay. Speed, same as always. Okay. Here I've labeled speed as v for velocity. We know the difference between them. I probably won't ask you for direction very often, but notice that here my units are meters per second. Okay, and it's just a ratio of distance to time. Okay, when we're talking about distance, generally we're talking about wavelength. Okay, and when we're talking about time, generally we're talking about period. Okay, quick check for understanding. This is a transverse wave. What is its amplitude? Go ahead and pause and give it a try. Okay, the correct answer for this one is B, 1 meter. When we're measuring amplitude, we're measuring from the rest position to the highest point, or from the rest position to the lowest point, in which case that's 1 meter and 1 meter. Okay, next question. What is the wavelength? Go ahead and pause, give it a try. Okay, in this case, when we're looking at wavelength, we pick two of the same point. So maybe I'll pick the tippy top and the tippy top. And here is 2 meters. Here is 4 meters. So the distance between those then is 2 meters. 2 meters. Okay, let's keep going. All right. One of the last things that we have on this PowerPoint is talking about what happens to waves when they hit ends. And one of those ends is called a fixed end. And whenever a wave hits a fixed end, it will bounce back and it will be in the opposite direction. It will be inverted, the opposite of whatever it was. Okay? And a fixed end means that my end can't move. So when I look at this, I can have this create a pulse for me, and I can look at what happens. Ooh, I don't want that. I can look at what happens to it and notice that it bounces back. And since it's fixed, it bounces back on the opposite side that it went in. That's very important. If I have a free end, or an end where my wave is not restricted, then my wave will still bounce back because it's still a barrier, but it will bounce back in the same direction that it was in when it went in. Okay, in this case, upright. So when I look at this, I make this a loose end, I can pulse, notice that it bounces back. Now when it hits this fixed end, it's going to bounce back in the opposite direction, but when it hits the loose end, it bounces back just as it was. Okay, let's keep going. And the last thing we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint is wave interference. And we will talk about this more in depth. But when we talk about wave interference, we're talking about something called superposition, or the superposition principle. And superposition occurs when two or more waves are in the same space at the same time, essentially is what we're looking at. And when that happens, there are two important things that occur. One, each wave maintains its own identity and is unaffected by any other waves. Okay? But when two or more waves are in the same space, their overall amplitude at any point is the sum of the individual amplitudes. That's it. So, when two traveling waves can pass through each other, neither one is destroyed and neither one is altered, but they add on top of each other. So when I'm looking at this picture here, notice that even though this bigger wave is going faster than this smaller wave, all it's really doing is it's essentially jumping on top of that smaller wave and then just keeps moving right through as if nothing happened. The smaller wave just keeps doing what it was doing as if nothing ever disturbed it. Okay? When we're talking about wave interference, it's really just a combination of the separate waves, and they produce a resultant wave. That's interference. Okay? When the displacements by the two pulses are in the same direction, when they build on top of each other, like this picture does, that's called constructive interference. They are constructing on top of one another. When the displacements caused by the two pulses are in opposite directions, that's called destructive interference. They destruct one another. They knock one another out. And a good example of destructive interference is here. If we start this, okay, notice that we're here and we can actually move this through, and notice that as we're going, now my wave has been destroyed. But as I continue through, my wave just keeps going. Okay, so if I reset this and just watch it, it's destroyed momentarily, and then both just keep going as if nothing was ever there. Okay, similarly, if I make both waves on the same side, I get a constructive interference occurring, and they build on top of one another and then just keep traveling through as if nothing happened. Okay, I hope that you've enjoyed this video lecture. We will chat later.